This is Politics Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. Bill Kristol is a leading conservative thinker, writer, founder of the Weekly Standard, and editor-at-large of the Bulwark. Many big names in Republican politics today, like Josh Hawley and Tucker Carlson, are people who Bill hired or mentored or otherwise worked with early in their careers. Bill also worked in the White House during the first Bush administration, so he's well placed to talk about where the Republican Party is today, where it was then, and where it's going in the future. As a quick reminder, all of our events are taped 100% live. Anyone who wants to can join to ask any guest a question. For a schedule of live events, past episodes, and a chance to sign up for our very special newsletter, which will give you our best of delivered right to your inbox twice a month, please visit our website, pm101.live. Our next episode coming out this Wednesday will feature David Gergen, an advisor to Presidents Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and Clinton. If you like what you hear and want to hear more, please hit subscribe and give us a rating on whichever podcast streaming service you're using right now. This is a big help as our community grows. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
Bill, today you tweeted out something that was hilarious. I was laughing my ass off, pardon my language. But you also pissed off all of my progressive friends because maybe they just don't have that good of a sense of humor. But you basically said that Biden is going to pick VP Harris as the Supreme Court justice and then Mitt Romney as his vice president. So I have to ask you on a personal note, Bill, how much satisfaction do you get from trolling progressives on Twitter?
I'm not a troll. I'm a serious person just putting out constructive ideas for the good of the country, Justin. So I thought it was kind of amusing. Well, A, I thought maybe it was mildly amusing. B, I don't think it's totally out of the question, 100% out of the question, that he could decide to suggest to Vice President Harris that she might enjoy being a Supreme Court justice. It would be a good one. And honestly, I don't know about progressives, but almost every Democrat I talked to is not thrilled with the idea of Kamala Harris as the nominee in 2024, assuming Biden doesn't run for a second term. So why not clear it away? The Romney thing obviously is provocative, but this really I thought actually what he should do probably is make Romney Secretary of State once we're in this crisis and, get some support for his foreign policy. But that seemed a little more too complicated to suggest on Twitter. So I just went with go right for the VP thing. But yeah, national unity government, it would be popular, I think. Progressives would love. What do progressives not want Harris on the court for? Or are they just upset about the Romney thing, do you think?
I think it was probably the Romney thing.
Or just me doing it, I'm sure, and I know. But the truth is, think of it. So this is my semi-serious point. They're probably going to overturn or radically restrict Roe v. Wade at the end of the term, and Breyer's leaving. So you do have a chance, if you're a Democrat, if you're a liberal, if you're a progressive, to pick fights on the court, on the right to choice versus the right to life. Those are not fights that are bad, I think, for the Democrats, given the other kinds of fights they're likely to have, and given where they sit right now in the polls. It might shake things up and be a fight that would certainly mobilize progressives. I mean, do you want to lose the Senate and never have another appointment? Don't we see how important the court now is? If, let's say, it overturns Roe v. Wade, pretty good argument, I should think, for Warnock in Georgia and for the Democratic Senate nominee in Pennsylvania and so forth, to at least mobilize Democrats. And then, if you have a sort of quasi-national unity administration with someone like Romney as VP, you're reaching across the aisle, especially in foreign policy, then you get some of your moderate Republicans coming back, perhaps, as they did in 2018, to vote against the Republican Party for Biden. And maybe you actually hold the House and the Senate. Isn't that worth an awful lot? Maybe progressives should think a little bit longer term than just, I didn't like Mitt Romney in 2012, and therefore this would be such a bad idea. I mean, having said all that, I will acknowledge that it's not likely to happen, and it was a certain kind, in a way, it was trolling, but I still think the point of it was, I would say, to the degree there was a serious point, it was to make people think a little bit about, okay, well, maybe this isn't a good idea. Is there a different way to accomplish some of these things? Should there be a Mitt Romney type somewhere in the cabinet? Is Biden losing some opportunities to reach out just with some symbolic stuff? And how do you think about the politics of the Supreme Court nomination? So at least maybe I got some people thinking about that.
But kind of digging into that, you are hitting on a message of unity. You're hitting on across the aisle bipartisanship. These words tend to be not really praised by progressives or conservatives for that matter. Does the current Democratic Party message resonate with key swing voters like white suburban women who split their votes sometimes and did so in 2020?
Look, I long ago decided I was no expert on the psyche of the American voter, and I obviously read polls and see some focus groups, read about them at least. Can't really stand to watch them, but I read about them. And I, live here in America, so I think I have some sense, but I don't claim to be an expert. I just look at the polls. Clearly, Biden's been hurt. I talked to my colleague Sarah Longwell, who's done a lot of focus groups, and they're consistent with what a lot of other people have found. Not just upper middle class suburban women, but working class men and women, including Hispanics and blacks, not so thrilled with aspects of the Democratic Party. So you don't have to believe me. You shouldn't believe me. I've never really claimed to be much of a diviner of the American public, but believe some of the polls, believe that Biden's at 42 or 43%, believe that right now Democrats probably lose the House. And now you can either complain about the American people, which is fine, it's perfectly legitimate and legal to do. That's why we have a First Amendment, but doesn't get you too much good in the short term politically, probably. Or you can think about how to change the dynamics. Now, I think the progressives are right to say, look, every time someone in the center says, "Oh, centrism is always more popular than being more on the left and more progressive," that's not true either. There are some progressive ideas that are very popular, some others that really put off people. A lot of it depends how it's framed and how the fight is carried. I do think actually the progressives are so wrapped up in some of their economic messages and some of the voting rights stuff, some of which I'm sympathetic to, but they should think more about the court nomination, the courts in general, a sense that they're really cutting back on rights, Roe v. Wade stuff. I mean, I think the progressives just need to think more politically if they want to hold the majority, the rather narrow majority that I was pleased to work with them to win in 2020 for Biden.
Do you believe that, assuming Roe v. Wade is overturned, do you believe it's going to more take energy away from the grassroots Republicans that rode the Tea Party wave into office, that are really big in the March to Life? Or do you think that the Democratic Party, which is a much more diverse party, which cuts across a lot of different groups of people, will be able to unify and effectively use this message in the same way the Republicans have for the last, 50 years?
I mean, don't you think it's so, the country's become so polarized, so regionally split on some of these issues, and then split by states and within states, that a lot depends on the congressional district you're in or the state you're in as to whether overturning Roe is kind of the vindication of efforts for 50 years. And I say this as someone who's mostly pro-life. So, I mean, I don't mean this in any ironic way. I mean, I think a lot of people will think this is what we've been working for and this is great. And now let's go at the state legislative level and try to restrict abortions to a much more limited time, if not entirely. That will be the dynamic in some states. And maybe being a pro-choice Democrat will be harder in some of those states. I think there are a lot of these swing states, though, that are either mostly pro-choice or sort of in between. Virginia, where I live, would be a case, but I think Pennsylvania and some of the others. And I think especially if the Republicans look like the radical party, that's the key on this issue. Most people are in between. Clinton was very shrewd when he said, lesafe, legal, and rare. So it's legal, but safe, whatever that means, and then rare. So, give a little bit of showing that it's, you'd like to limit the number or reduce the number. Democrats have become too radical, in my view. We don't need to have the federal government paying for abortions, I don't think, and so forth. But if the Democrats can stay sort of in the middle and just say, look, why is the court radically making this change after 50 years? And this was political, and they rammed through these appointments under Trump at the last minute and so forth. I think a lot of Americans will think, maybe the Roe v. Wade abortion regime was too permissive and some of these state laws are reasonable. But why, if the court goes as far as it may, why have they gone this far and thrown everything up in the air? Why are we having debates in 30 different state legislatures suddenly in September of 2022 about abortion law? Is this really the best use of our time? Is this healthy for the country? And so a lot depends on how the court, where the court comes down. Does it come down sort of in between? Does it come down strongly on one side? And then how much Democrats and Republicans can say, wait a second, do you realize that the other party is really committed to a radical doctrine here? And I do think the Republicans in general, and I don't know what you think about this, you've worked with that party too, obviously, it's been they've paid no price for kind of adopting or tolerating at least or marching side by side with pretty radical versions of their own views. So they were anti-gun control for some decent reasons, actually. But then somehow that's now morphed into being for, the use, the ability to purchase and to have sort of any gun anywhere at any time, right? And that's not where most Americans are. If the Democrats can frame some of these issues in the center and make it the Republicans, the radical extreme party, use Republican rhetoric, use the extremism of members like Marjorie Taylor Greene and others, kind of put that picture of the Republican Party out there by November of 2022, I think that moves some voters in the middle and helps the Democrats.
Well, with the exception, Bill, of Trump in 2020, and still the Republicans did prosper because they were able to take House seats back. I think it goes back to 2010, and my former boss, Tim Huelskamp, rode that Tea Party wave into office, and people used to think that it was maybe all about this deficit spending. But come on, we cut the bullshit. We know that the American public doesn't really care in a large way about deficit spending. That was the beginning of the culture war, the culture warrior. If you just look at what the Freedom Caucus turned into with Mark Meadows, Jim Jordan, Tim Huelskamp, Mick Mulvaney, it wasn't that these people were great policy minds. They're not. They are just bombastic flamethrowers. So I honestly, Bill, I don't know if the Republican Party will pay a price for being more extreme, because the way that they're able to energize voters is by projecting that they're fighters. And the only way you're able to do that is to pick issues that you're able to continue the fight on. And that just continues to move the party in one direction. So I'm curious, when we've seen that the base of the Republican Party truly resonates with this type of pugilistic fighting. I think David Drucker, we had him on the show, and he said that any prerequisite for a 2024 candidate is that they must be a culture warrior. I'm worried that the culture war aspect of everything is going to energize the base so much, and then the Democratic response is going to be so over the top that these swing voters we're talking about look at both parties and say, I'm okay with going with the Republicans.
Look, I think you've made very intelligently the case for why the Republicans might sort of get away with it. My colleague Sarah Longwell calls it, you speak like Trump to the Trump voters, you're a culture warrior to the culture warriors. But then when you get to Northern Virginia here, you're Glenn Youngkin and you're a guy at a vest and you're a business guy. And, you say some things to keep some of these voters happy, but basically you're a tax cutting, kind of deregulatory, business friendly Republican. That's a little tricky to navigate. Youngkin did it in a gubernatorial race, harder to do it at the federal level. And that's what but I don't know. I mean, I think you make the point, you raised the question very well. I don't know, was it always as culture war? You were there in 2010, 11. I guess I did think there was an element of freedom, the Freedom Caucus, an element of kind of almost libertarianism, an element of limited government, constitutionalism. I didn't agree with all of it, but I thought there was a little more of that than pure culture war. I may just have been wrong, and I may have sort of been wishful thinking on my part. But they called it the Freedom Caucus, but it pretty quickly became the Culture War Caucus. And by about 2015, when obviously Trump saw that coming and really capitalized on it with immigration and with a whole bunch of other issues. I probably should have seen it coming in the late 2000s when a little more than I did. I was on the side of Bush and McCain on immigration, and it was the most unpopular thing, one of the most unpopular positions we took when I edited the Weekly Standard, that our own readers didn't like. And our own readers are not, they were pretty upscale, paying, a decent amount to subscribe to a pretty, intelligent magazine, if I could say, 60, 70,000 people, not millions, not like Fox News, but even they were mostly, even by then, had sort of an initial like immigration, where I would say economically they probably should have been for pretty liberal immigration as business owners and so forth. They felt like they were losing the culture. So I think I've probably underestimated that issue a bit over the years, and maybe I'm too hopeful now that it can be blunted. But look, I mean, the other thing, as you look, the Republicans are going to play that card, as you sort of said. I mean, they're not going to not play the card. So the question for the Democrats is: do you just go into fetal position, so to speak, and just go into a huddle? Do you fight back and become extreme on your own side? Or do you try to say, no, 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 we want to help the police, but you're being demagogic and in saying, we want to defund the police, or defending every aspect of every police arrest or something like that, or as if there had never been any abuses? I don't know. Isn't there a way to kind of go up the middle a little bit for the Democrats? I guess that's for me the question with it, that putting Romney or whatever as VP, that talking a little more. I'll give you another example. I mean, when there was about a month ago, the new mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, a black former cop, actually, sort of got elected, and then he gave his little inaugural speech, and he was pretty tough on crime. And he announced a couple of things that were kind of tough on crime, and we've got to reverse this trend in New York. The mayor of San Francisco, an African-American woman, said we've let it go too far with homelessness and vagrancy, and we need to get tough. Sort of sounded like a very mild but still version of, Rudy Giuliani from 1989 or 1993. The former mayor of Philadelphia, an African-American, attacked the DA, who's a liberal white progressive, for letting too many people out of jail and making bail too easy. And leaving aside the merits of this, and these are complicated issues of criminal justice, obviously, clearly there's a sentiment out there, not just among upper middle class whites, that it's gone too far in the other direction.
Now, this has the makings of total breakdown of the government.
If the administration wants cooperation, it will have to begin to move in our direction.
We will have moved from the most productive Congress in the last 50 years to one of the least productive in our lifetimes.
Our top political priority over the next 2 years should be to deny President Obama a second term.
Governor Sununu of my home state of New Hampshire went and he met with Mitch McConnell. They were trying to get him to run because he'd be a shoo-in to take a seat away from Maggie Hassan. And he just recently gave an interview to the Washington Examiner saying he's not going to run for the Senate because when he spoke to Republicans, they said that their next goal is going to be to obstruct everything until 2024. So even things like trying to combat competition with China and the U.S., we don't need to get into legislation, but things that the public, the left, the progressive left, the liberal left, the center, the right, all agree on, it sounds like there's just no path for that unity. And I get worried that this is kind of a different time where we do have that obstructionism. So my question to you, you founded the Weekly Standard in 95. The year before, we saw the Republicans win 54 seats in the House, and it was dubbed the Republican Revolution. I'm wondering, from back then in 1994, the issues that were being fought about, to today, in the culture war, we hear in the media, it's move left, it's move right. You don't need to use these dumbed down left and right terms, but how has the country moved from 94 to today? And how have you moved, and your views, how have they changed on some of the culture issues?
So that's a big question. I'll try to be brief. I mean, I would just say on the current moment, I agree with you that the Republican Party has been radicalized, is the way I would put it, and a lot of it is purely obstructionist, purely culture warrior, purely performative. There, the Democrats just have to fight them, but in fighting them, my only point is fight them in a way you get 55% of the vote, not 45% of the vote, or 35, right? That's my only simple point there. And that's where I think some of the bipartisanship, you don't think most Republicans are going to suddenly be nice to Joe Biden if you put Mitt Romney in the cabinet or do a couple of things like that, but you do think maybe 5 or 10% move over. Look, I think the country's gotten, obviously, the parties have gotten so much more partisan. The Congress has gotten so much more partisan, and the country's gotten so much more polarized than 94. And 94 was already somewhat partisan with Newt and everything. But, we supported Clinton's intervention in Bosnia in December 95, 3 months after we started the Weekly Standard. We took a little grief from some of our readers. I didn't subscribe, remember one letter. I didn't subscribe to the Weekly Standard to read editorials supporting Bill Clinton. But, it was still at the time not that uncommon for both parties actually split on that, and for you to have kind of bipartisan coalitions, McCain and Dole and Clinton on something like that, and then in Kosovo, and that lasted obviously, and that came back again in a way after 9/11. Clinton and Gingrich cut a big budget deal in 1997, and there was welfare reform in 96. Education in 2001. So it was just, it was partisan at the time and getting worse, and the rules of Congress were contributing, and a lot of socioeconomic just shifts were contributing, the sorting out of people and so forth. But the real polarization, which I think is very dangerous, I take it that's kind of what yours is implying, and I think you're right. That really, I think, is the last 10, 15 years, don't you think? I mean, the way I think of it is we had partisanship, which is not great, but, we can survive as a country if the two parties in Congress are pretty partisan, especially if they're less partisan at the state and local level, which they used to be. Plenty of governors in the early 2000s, early 2010s were kind of moderate governors across Kasich, Hickenlooper, right? I mean, you can go around the country and find plenty. Rick Perry, even in Texas, certainly New Hampshire. I mean, governors of both parties weren't that different from each other. Now the partisanship has gotten much deeper. The governors tend to be more partisan, the state legislatures, and the people. That's what polarization means. That's what polarization is different from partisanship. Partisanship is, I usually vote Republican. Polarization is, this is my side. I hate the other side. I hate anything they're for. I don't trust their motives at all. I don't think they're patriotic. I don't think they wish the country well. And that's gotten so deep, more on the right than on the left. I really want to say that. I think that the left has problems, God knows. But the really kind of destructive radicalization and demonization of the other side is more on the right than on the left. And I feel that I underestimated those elements of the right. And I think I fought them at times. I fought Beth Buchanan. I supported Clinton on Bosnia, as I've said, and other issues like that. But I think I underestimated just how much of that was around, and that when you got an effective demagogue like Trump, and when he becomes president for 4 years and spends 4 years fanning those flames and encouraging the grievances and the hatreds and the resentments and sort of legitimizing those kinds of expressions. The way I think of it is people used to say these things at a bar at 11 o'clock at night, maybe to 3 for close friends. But then, mostly during the day, they lived as kind of good citizens of the U.S., sort of respecting or pretending to respect their fellow citizens. Now everything is like a bar at 11:30 at night, and that's bad for the country. And it's hard to put that toothpaste, to mix metaphors here, it's hard to put that toothpaste back in the tube.
And I think one of the reasons why many national security types left the GOP with the rise of Trump was that racism, was that overt attacks on institutions, even during his first campaign. So I got to ask you, Bill, you're big in the foreign policy world. We've seen a lot of the standard bearers of the intelligentsia of the GOP foreign policy establishment just leave the party. When they went anti-Trump, they've now received a deaf ear from a lot of the Republican figures. You yourself are not. You voted for President Biden. And now we have the Democrats, though. So we have a Republican Party that is kind of void of the establishment thinking, the intelligence, the force projection that any type of global hegemon is right to do in certain cases when they're defending democracies or their forms of government. And then on the left, we have Democrats who are kind of confrontation averse. Just look at Ukraine, Bill. They're not sanctioning Nord Stream 2. They're futzing around and not sending weapons as soon as they should, nor they're not sending enough weapons like Stingers. They're not setting up supply chains for resistance and asymmetric warfare. They're not doing things that America would do 30 years ago to protect a burgeoning democracy. Do you think that this voice of force projection that is missing from our politics is a good thing, or is it a dangerous thing?
So I think it's dangerous that not enough people in either party appreciate, I think, what undergirds this liberal world order we've had that has created a heck of a lot of peace and prosperity and freedom around the world for 70 years now. And compare these 70 years to the preceding 50 years. So I make no defense for sort of being a kind of Truman, JFK, Reagan, Bush, McCain type on foreign policy and free trade and strong liberal immigration, which has been great for this country. So those are unpopular views to some degree in both parties. But look, I think to be fair to the Democrats, I've been very critical of the Biden administration on some things like Afghanistan, I think somewhat on Ukraine. But on the other hand, it's not the McGovern administration, to be honest. And Clinton himself, who ended up doing okay, I think, started off kind of weak in foreign policy and then kind of strengthened. So I think there are a lot of fights going on in both parties. People who are sort of sticking with the Republican Party should fight the good fight there. I have zero problem with that. I myself, I'd say now, think I could maybe make a little more difference fighting within the Democratic Party. There are some pretty good Democratic members of Congress, senators, and especially some of the younger members of the House, many of whom served in the military or CIA or elsewhere in the national security world. They're pretty close to being where Republicans would have been 15 years ago, honestly, on a lot of these issues. So I'm not entirely pessimistic about that, but it's a little more complicated than it was once upon a time, where you sort of, okay, if you have these views, you go to this party. I came to Washington to work for the Reagan administration. I was excited to do that. I thought Reagan was on the right path. That was a little less. That was sort of unproblematic, right? I don't know exactly when you came and if you had sort of a similar sense, but I think now a lot of people like me, though, who love McCain also had that sense. We're from McCain. This is the party and the team that who really want to fight for freedom around the world and so forth, and do our best to help. Not always brilliantly or successfully, perhaps, but with good intentions. I think it's more complicated because you have to sort of fight within both parties to make this case.
Well, considering it's more complicated, Bill, and you do have foreign policy chops, how would you evaluate the U.S. response to the Russia-Ukraine issue?
I think we don't know yet fully. I think it was slow, and I think Biden was a little weak at the beginning. In Afghanistan, we paid a huge price for, and no question that everyone saw that, and then immediately decided, I guess they just aren't willing to stand up anywhere. I will say, to be fair, though, in the last few weeks, the Biden administration is certainly sounding pretty tough. They're claiming that these sanctions and the responses will be very severe against Putin. They are talking about moving troops there to help deter. So I would say, as Mitch McConnell, who's pretty partisan, said, I think yesterday, didn't he? Something like a day or two ago, said something like, they're moving in the right direction. So, again, I'm hopeful that Biden will continue to move in the right direction. I wish there were a little stronger foreign policy team there. It doesn't feel like it's, the equivalent of George Shultz and Dick Cheney and Jim Baker and Brent Scowcroft quite, but maybe that's just, you look back and these people look like giants. You look at the ones around you and you think, well, they're not as good. Maybe they'll step up to it, though. So I hope they do.
I think Jim Baker was universally liked during his time and after his time, though. So not sure if that bodes well for this crew of Biden loyalists. But I do want to ask you more of a personal question before we go over to the audience here. So David Brooks interviewed attendees at a national conservatism conference. It's full of these MAGA people, these real MAGA people. And one of them told him, and I think you know where I'm going with this, we'd like to dislike Bill Kristol, but he got all of us jobs, meaning that you'd hired them in the past. Did you work with or even mentor many of the figures now in MAGA land? And I really want you to name some names here, Bill. Who has disappointed you the most?
So I worked with some of them, hired some of them. I think also, how Washington is. A lot of them I didn't really mentor, that sounds too fancy, or get them jobs. But, I was here. I was pretty accessible. I wasn't in government during the Bush years, the George W. Bush years. So if you were, I'll give you a true example. If you were Josh Hawley and you came to Washington, I think his wife was clerking for the Chief Justice, and he was, I don't know quite what he was doing. He was writing a book on Teddy Roosevelt. He wrote a book review for us. He came to visit. We had coffee or something like that. He got to know some of the people in our office who were more his age. J.D. Vance, when he wrote his book, we had a couple of friends in common, who knew each other from when he had served in the military. And he again, I think we had lunch and we were on some panels together. You know how Washington is. So I think it's, I won't claim to have been like some grand, mentor or employer of all these people. But I certainly tried to help help them out, introduce them to some people, publish some of them in the Weekly Standard. And they all, and at the time, J.D. Vance in 2016, he's getting attacked for this now, actually, in Ohio, was anti-Trump. And, so many of them have gone along with where they see the power is. And they're not wrong. I mean, they're wrong, I think, morally, but I mean, they're not wrong that that's where the power is for now in the Republican Party. Tucker Carlson worked at the Weekly Standard from right at the beginning for about 5 years. He's a whole generation younger than I, so he hung out with the 25-year-olds and I hung out with my peers, And so we weren't like, intimately close or anything, but we worked in the same office 5 days a week, and we were totally friendly. I had a high regard for Tucker, a very talented journalist, of all the young people we had at the Weekly Standard, he was one of the best in the sense of, as a 24-year-old, he could, submit copy that was, 3,000 words, beautifully constructed, interesting read, kind of all the little things. Normally younger writers, I didn't have to do this myself, but one of the managing editors would have to spend some kind of a lot of time kind of chopping the piece up and getting it into shape and making sure it had a good lead to get people interested, and then a good kicker at the end. Tucker had a great natural ability for that. Tucker's very smart. The degree to which he has just, become not just sort of, a bit of a panderer, but I mean, really a dangerous force in America, I think, is very sad, I think, and bad. I mean, really distressing. So it's weird. I mean, I guess, for most of the time I was in Washington, as I got here in 85, I'd say 85 to 2010 probably. There were people I got closer to and drifted away from, people who did turn against me or vice versa, maybe on Iraq, or some people like Pat Buchanan, whom I didn't like, and so forth. But, basically the people I was friendly with when I got here, shortly after I got here, was a lot of them were the same people I was friendly with 20 years later, or with people who came here in the same tradition. That really has changed in the last 5, 6, 7 years. And so some of them I'm still extremely friendly with, but others where, I'm not in shouting matches with them, but I just don't see them. And I don't like what they've become or what they're doing.
Why would we take Ukraine's side? Why wouldn't we on Russia's side? I'm totally confused.
Russia isn't showing up on the border with ballot boxes. They're showing up on the border with tanks. And we're on the side of democracy.
Yeah, I'm guessing for democracy, I guess. Nancy Pelosi has just announced a new select committee in the Congress to investigate the great January 6th insurrection, the fake one where the elderly people showed up with signs on the Capitol. In Hungary, the government is for its own people. Viktor Orban, not radical at all. It's hardly a right-wing country. So the journalists who claim this, they claim Orban is a threat to the free press. The press corps in Hungary is far more balanced than it is here.
Beware the temptation of pride, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil.
So I do want to go to the audience, but I have to follow up. And I'm sure you haven't spoken to Tucker in a while, but do you think he actually believes the anti-American, pro-Viktor Orban, pro-Russian, pro-January 6th messages, or is he pandering? And if he does believe it, did he have some type of crisis that caused him to go insane?
I don't know, Justin. I mean, it's hard to say. It's obviously hard to see inside people's psyches. Tucker always had a touch of the, I'm going to shock people. He always had a little intrigue. He was always intrigued by a certain kind of Buchananite, right-wing, kind of paleo-conservative, I'm going to go a little further than just the respectable argument that Paul Ryan is making here for traditional conservatism type of conservatism. So he always had a little taste for that. But the degree to which he's gone in that direction, I do find pretty astonishing. At some point, people, if they're a public figure too, the distinction between what you, quote, really believe and what you say all the time becomes less operative. I mean, there are some people who are such incredible cynics, the classic con man in a movie or in a novel, right? He literally can go on the stage, 6 hours a day, pitch things, sell things, convince people of things, walk off the stage, walk backstage and say, well, that was all bullshit, and that I think the suckers bought it today. But most people aren't really like that, Most people sort of talk themselves into what they're selling. And I think the Josh Hawleys and the J.D. Vances, they've probably gradually rationalized what was originally a kind of, well, I'll say a few things to kind of keep alive in this party, I want to have a political future. And then it's sort of, there's a point to this, and we do need to be tougher. And some of the violent stuff, it's a little, I don't know, maybe we shouldn't be too violent, but a little bit of it, teach the left a lesson, and you go step by step. One thing I've learned over these last 5, 6, 7 years is that I really had underestimated was the power of rationalization, of sort of, you talk yourself into one thing and then into the next step, And before you know it, you're 8 steps further along in justifying something pretty bad.
Yeah, I switched parties and burned down my political network, so I don't have too much sympathy for these people not being able to see that they're playing with others' lives and the
Right. No, the Tucker stuff is horrible. I mean, to have a guest on fire, literally to be encouraging people not to be vaccinated. I mean, you are just getting people killed. I mean, there's no, and as someone made this point, I saw this article I read the last day or two. There's no point to it. I mean, it's not like, it's one thing if you make a miscalculation about foreign policy or even the election lie. That's terrible if you do it knowingly, but it's sort of a political fight, you could still say. And you just think it's so important that you guys be in power for the sake of the pro-life cause or for the sake of whatever you're talking yourself into at this point, that you're going to sort of fudge the truth a little bit on the votes in the election. That's still another level from literally telling people something that when you're vaccinated and boosted, that is going to make them much more at risk of dying, and doing so, why? Because it's pure demagoguery, pure catering to uninformed and deceived people.
We will go to Shanette, who was an appointee in the first Bush administration, and then we will go to Eric.
Thanks so much, Justin, and thank you, Bill, for doing this. I worked for Ron Kaufman in the first Bush administration. I've been a fan of yours for a very long time. My question is actually related to when Pence spoke to Quayle. So you were actually the first person I thought of when I heard about the fact that he went to consult the former vice president about what he should or shouldn't do when it related to January 6th. And so I'd just love to get your thoughts on how you think that conversation went down, and if you think there's any chance that Pence will ultimately cooperate with the investigation and sort of be a little bit of a hero. I'd love to get your thoughts on that. Thanks.
So, yeah, no, I was proud of Dan Quayle. I worked for her, obviously, for 4 years in the George H.W. Bush administration. I mean, I had nothing to do with it. I didn't know what had happened. I sort of drifted out of touch with Vice President Quayle, partly because he was more accommodating of Trump than I was, and I didn't want to bother. I didn't want to have an argument with him, we just didn't sort of compare notes much on politics the way we had for a bunch of years, of course, after I worked for him. So, but when I read about it, when I heard about it, I was proud that Dan Quayle told Pence to urged Pence to do the right thing, and that Pence did do the right thing, for which he deserves some credit. I think Sarah's a little too categorical when she says there's no chance that Pence has a future. I mean, but Pence, he did straddle so much, and he remains so timid about taking on Trump, and he still says he was so proud to have served for him. I think he'd be better advised at this point to almost make a clean break. But what's so striking about so many of the people who know better, who did, to their credit, stop some of the worst things from happening in the Trump years. And I know some of those people. And I'm very never Trump, but I was never dogmatic about people shouldn't go in the White House and work for the government and so forth. A lot of people asked my opinion in 2017 early on. And I think some of them, if they were going to jobs where they thought they could do good for the country, not compromise their own principles, I thought, look, you got to go in there and do your best. And so H.R. McMaster and John Kelly, not that they were doing what I told them, but I mean, those types, people who worked for them, I thought it did some good. Mattis at defense. I think it gradually got harder to do good over those 4 years, and the whole party got so radicalized and everything that by the end I didn't have much sympathy for anyone who was still hanging on. And I think the 2020 election for me was important. That if you weren't willing to step up and say, look, I served this administration, and I think we did some good, and I did some good, I hope, but we can't have this guy for 4 more years. It's too dangerous. Now, a few people did say that, and they came to work with us at Republican Voters Against Trump, Olivia Joy and Miles Taylor, and one or two others. I'm kind of blanking on them, but and I give them a lot of credit because they took a huge amount of grief for doing that. And then Liz Cheney, who had sort of held her tongue, you might say, made her peace with Trump for those while she was in Congress. After she saw what Trump was doing after November 3rd, of course, broke definitively after January 6th. And it's very much to her credit that she doesn't mess around with a kind of, well, I broke, but I'm not totally broken, and I'm just going to kind of try to duck, She understands we cannot have Trump as president again, which means if you're a Republican, you can't support him for the nomination, which means you can't say you would support him even if he wins the nomination. I really give Liz Cheney a lot of credit. So I think look, she's got a big primary in Wyoming. If Liz Cheney wins that primary, if a couple of other primaries, the more moderate candidate defeats the Trumpiest candidate, I think the dynamic could change. I don't think these things are set in stone. Right now, it looks pretty grim. Right now, the dynamic, I think Justin said this early on in this hour, is pretty much the other way in the Republican Party, which is why I don't have great hopes for it. And why I think there's plenty more to work with in the Democrats. But it'd be great if we had a much bigger Liz Cheney, Larry Hogan wing of the Republican Party a year or two from now.
Thank you for that, Jeanette. We will go on to Eric Foster and then Antoine Jackson. Eric, over to you.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Bill. I have a question, and it relates to kind of the pro-democracy coalition in America. Last three elections, 54, 56, and 53% of voters, be it voting for Democrats and third-party candidates, were the majority of the voters. And then 25% of the Republican voters are non-Trump voters. Why is there so much of the conversation about the Trump voter from both the media, traditional media, and the conservative mainstream media, and ignoring the rest of us? Because I do feel that my voice doesn't get acknowledged in most of the conversation. It's worrying about getting or trying to win that 50 plus million that are stuck in the Trump camp versus the rest of us, including the non-Trump Republican voters. Thank you.
No, it's a very good point, actually. And I've thought about it myself in terms of what we cover at the Bulwark and so forth. I mean, obviously, Trump, when he was president, you had to cover Trump and you had to talk about his political support and whether it was as strong as people thought or not. And then there were the primaries, and Trump has defeated the non-Trump candidates, and so you had to kind of 147 House Republicans voted to overturn the election. So the question of how Trumpy is the Republican Party and what motivates the Trump base and why do they believe these conspiracies, those are all legitimate, obviously, questions for people to explore. But I do kind of agree that 55 or 60 or 65% of the country kind of got left behind a little bit. And then a lot of the real progressives get a fair amount of ink because they're interesting and bold and it's AOC and so forth. But then your centrists just kind of get left a little bit in the middle. I've talked with a lot of centrist Democrats actually about this who are frustrated by this. Abigail Spanberger and a ton of the younger members of Congress, Alyssa Slotkin, Jason Crow. There's so many who are really quite good. And Michael Bennet from Colorado and Hickenlooper and Governor Polis, really start to think about it. Joe Biden himself, of course, Buttigieg, I would say, Raimondo. I mean, you start looking around, there are quite a lot of people who are on the Democratic side and some on the Republican side who I would say are reasonable and they deserve to be known better. Now, I would say they don't make it as easy as they should to get themselves known better. They've got to be a little bolder, take positions, pick fights with, of course, the right, but also with sort of the left of their own party and say, wait a second, this is what it means to be pro-market, but also pro a reasonable role for government. This is what it means to respect the Second Amendment, but say that we don't. That doesn't mean that every single person can carry any kind of gun he wants into any store or school or, establishment at any time. And I think that, I don't know, somehow that hasn't quite come together. I hope Biden would make that happen. I mean, Biden is a pretty moderate Democrat. He's got pretty moderate Democrats in his administration. He's done some good things, but he hasn't really articulated. I don't think he's seen that as his role, maybe. Like here's what, a new centrist democracy coalition should be for, and here are the kind of boundaries of it, and let's explicitly try to work together. There's been a little bit of that, and obviously they've been bipartisan bills, infrastructure, there'll be an attempt now on fixing the Electoral Count Act, the guardrails for how the electoral college votes get counted and so forth. But I think your point's a good point, that we need to be more purposeful about making that positive pro-democracy coalition case.
Thank you very much, Eric. Always a good question. So we're going to go to Aram. Aram, over to you.
Hey, Bill, thanks for being here, and thanks, Justin, for having the room as always. Bill, I've disagreed with you for, I guess, a couple decades now that I've been politically aware. But I really deeply agree with you on the open letter in defense of democracy that you put out with Todd Gitlin and Jeffrey Isaac. And very much agree with you on the stakes that we're facing right now when it comes to our elections in particular. I actually do some political communication work for the Open Source Election Technology Institute, which is one of the orgs out there trying to find good solutions to these problems. And so I've got a question for you. I think one, how do we get those solutions adopted as policy? And two, how can we wrest back this phrase of election integrity, which is one I've always held very dear, but I think has been polluted by a bunch of ideas that really have nothing to do with integrity or even elections, really. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks for the kind words. And I totally agree about the second thing. I don't know. These phrases are hard to get back once they get used in a certain way. And so maybe we just have to be for free and fair elections and let them have election, quote, integrity or something like that. But we need to be against election subversion, which is really what the Republican Party is now laying the groundwork for in a bunch of states. So that's, I think, is a very important agenda item. And I would have liked parts of the For the People Act and for the John Lewis Act to be enacted as well. But I think there is a bipartisan group working together on fixing some of the it's called the Electoral Count Act, but really the kind of guardrails for how the electoral college stuff works from election day on till November 3rd to January 6th, 2020, in a sense. And that's very important to fix and strengthen. It doesn't solve everything, but it can help. Look, on the first point, I respect the work you guys do. I think it's one of the real tragedies of the current polarization is, there's just so little serious policy work on anything. So obviously, I think we need to make all kinds of changes in all kinds of aspects of our life, economy, social media is very problematic. I think the way the algorithms work and all that. On the other hand, it's not so easy just to fix it. There are all kinds of First Amendment issues, practical issues, and it's not, you can't just snap your fingers and say, okay, let's get rid of the bad aspects of Facebook and have the good ones and so forth. But that's what you need to have a serious public policy debate on: legislative proposals, hearings, conferences, seminars, kind of the boring stuff that Washington people used to do. But it's kind of important if it kind of works out okay, if you can get somewhere on it. And there, too, I think the Biden administration has been sort of unimaginative. Like, what's on issues ranging from immigration to social media, there are all these sort of demagogic stuff on the right and some on the left. But there are a lot of practical things that could be done. You don't have to solve every problem. But I do feel like the problem-solving side of things has lagged a little bit here.
I'm wondering, you've worked in politics, you became a household name in 95. So what to younger voters, I'm 33 myself, what does this look like from your perspective where you've been an expert here, you've lived in D.C., you've kind of seen it all or a lot of things. Should we be hopeful? Should we be pessimistic or somewhere in between? And what do you think about the current situation? Will we get through it?
So I think some of both. Some hopeful is good, but a kind of hard-headed pessimism, I think in the short, medium term is good. So I think we can get through it, but I think it's a mistake to assume, if we just kind of get one good election result here or get the electoral count out fixed and maybe Liz Cheney hangs on in Wyoming, then we're kind of over it. It's not going to be like that. This is not like a disease you get and it's dangerous, but once you get over it, you're as good as new and you just can forget about it for the next 20 years. There's been so much damage done, I do think, to our public discourse, in terms of polarization, radicalization, conspiratorialism, everything else. It's going to take a while to get better. So this is more like a disease where you can get over the worst part of it, you can strengthen yourself, but we're going to need a fair amount of rehabilitation, a fair amount of really addressing these problems. So I think for younger people, in a way, it's exciting in the sense that I think you have a real chance to help save American democracy, which is not a small thing, but also to really strengthen it. There's a ton of issues, since they range from some of these regulating new technologies to immigration to foreign policy, economic policy, where we obviously need some fresh thinking. We haven't had much really in the last decade or so, and we're not. Biden's busy doing what he can do in a few areas, but we're not getting a huge amount now. With the Republican Party, we're getting almost none. So I think it's really time to be ambitious in the sense of it's time to be urgent about saving democracy, but ambitious over the medium and long term about improving our country and our democracy in all kinds of ways. And there are a whole bunch of 21st century challenges that are different from the 20th century challenges. So I do think young people should be ambitious and not just focused on the next weeks and months and years. So that's also important to focus on as well. But just getting over that's not enough. We really need to improve things going forward.
That's all we have for you today. Again, huge thanks to Bill for coming out, to our audience for their questions, and to you for being here. All of our events are taped 100% live. Anyone who wants to can join to ask any guest a question. For a schedule of live events, as well as past episodes, and a chance to sign up for our newsletter, which will give you our best of delivered to your inbox twice per month, please visit our website, pm101.live. Our next episode coming out this Wednesday will feature David Gergen, an advisor to Presidents Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and Clinton. If you like what you hear and want to hear more, please hit subscribe and give us a rating on whichever podcast streaming service you're using right now. It's a big help as our community grows, and that'll ensure you don't miss out. This has been Politics and Media 101, produced in partnership with Clubhouse. I'm Jeff Browning, on behalf of Justin Higgins, our co-founder, and our team. Thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.